Okay, today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos 21, and today's Daf Yomi is sponsored by Gray in memory of her brother Bobby, her mother Beverly, and her grandmother Grace, and it's sponsored also by Jill Sachs in memory of her father, Chaim Feibel. So we're going to start on the bottom of 20b. And the Gemara there discusses the following case. We know that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. There's a prohibition. There's a violation of a prohibition, and he's also in violation of a positive commandment if he marries a widow. There's a prohibition that he's not allowed to marry a widow, and specifically there's also a positive commandment that he's required to marry a virgin. So let's say the Kohen Gadol's brother dies, and the Kohen Gadol does Yibum. He consummates the marriage with his brother's wife. He's not supposed to, but let's say he does that. So what's the story with that? So the Gemara tells us on the bottom of 20b, Idmar Bias Kohen Gadol Ba'amana, that Baruch Atah Mochom Shakol Name Baruch. Now let's say you have a Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who consummates the marriage with the widow. He does the Yibum with the widow. Then under those circumstances, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, Chad Amar Eina Potera Sarasa. So one of them says, it does nothing. It's not efficacious. The co-wife of that widow is still going to require Yibum or Chalitza, because since the act was done in sin, we're not going to say it's legally binding. Whereas Chad Amar Potera Sarasa, one says no, that it is effective, and it exempts her and her co-wife from Chalitza. Means to say she also is exempted by it. That Rashi is a little difficult, but anyway, that she is exempted from Yibum or Chalitza by doing by doing, even though it's done in a prohibition, it's still going to be effective. So the Gemara says, well, what type of widow are we even talking about here? We're on top of 21a. We know that by Jewish law that there's two parts to the marriage. There's the betrothal, where really the marriage has not been physically consummated yet, and then that's called the erusin. And then there's an nisuin, where they live together as husband and wife. So the Gemara says, if we're talking about a brother who is married to a woman, fully married, so that's from the nisuin, and everybody would say that under those circumstances that the act is not efficacious, and he is not exempted the co-wife from chalitza or yibum. Why? Because we say the eina say docharosa say vase, because then she's not a virgin and she's fully married, and so there's a positive commandment to do yibum with her, but there's also a positive commandment to marry a virgin, which he's not doing, and there's also a negative commandment not to marry a widow, and a positive commandment does not override a positive commandment and a negative commandment. Oh, let me just pause for a second and say tomorrow and the whole week, because of a Shiva, we're going to start 10 minutes later at 8:10 a.m., okay? 8:10 a.m. is tomorrow, and the whole week through Friday. So I'll try to remind you in the morning by texting you, but that's just the bottom line. So the Gemara says, Ki Puigi, so where are they arguing? They're only arguing in a circumstance where it is a almana from an erusin. What's an erusin? An erusin is a betrothal, so she's still a virgin. So man amar poteres, the one who says that it's effective, is because it's asiyase, the positive commandment of doing yibum overrides the simple prohibition of not marrying a widow, and so therefore it's an effective yibum, and the co-wife will be exempt. Whereas the position that says it's not effective, it's because we're not going to say the positive commandment overrides a negative commandment here, given the efshar b'chalitza. Because since there's another fix to this, that you don't have to say positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. You could do the chalitza, and so therefore you don't have to rely on the principle. And so therefore, since he could have done chalitza with her, i.e., quasi-divorce, and there's no reason to violate the negative commandment. That's the argument. So Meisveis, the Gemara says, but we have a brisa that says that if in this circumstance where there's a negative prohibition of marrying somebody, it was talking about a man who was a Krush Shifcha, that he was unable to produce seed, so you're not allowed to marry him. So under those circumstances, it states Vim Baru Kanu, that if he did Yibum, it's effective. So we see from here that even though there's a prohibition, the Yibum is effective. And so even though he could have done Chalitza, so this is the refutation of the one that says, of the opinion that states that if you could do another effect, that if you could do it another manner, then Yibum is not allowed. So it's a refutation. So isn't this a refutation of the position of Reish Lakish? Because we saw that Reish Lakish said on the earlier page, Reish Lakish said that any time where it says that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, then if you can fulfill both of them, okay. But if not, then the positive commandment should override the negative commandment. Meaning to say, Reish Lakish says the positive commandment only overrides the negative commandment where you can't do both. But in this case, you could do chalitza. And from the fact that the Brisa says that the Yibum still works, isn't this a refutation of Reish Lakish? Because you could have kept both. You could have not married her and also done the mitzvah of chalitza. So the Reish Lakish said, no. Reish Lakish would say, I would say this where that the positive commandment does not override the negative commandment in a case where you can also fulfill the mitzvah. But here, chalitza b'makom yibum lav mitzvah. Chalitza is not the same thing as yibum. It's not as good as a mitzvah. The real mitzvah is yibum, and chalitza is secondary, and so therefore it's not considered a mitzvah. And that's why we say that the positive commandment of yibum overrides the negative commandment of not marrying a widow if you're a kohen gadol. So Amar Rava says, now the Gemara shifts gears a little bit. The Gemara says, how do we know the Torah listed 21 biblical prohibitions? How do we know of relatives who are related to you that they're biblically prohibited to you? But how do we know that there is also rabbinic prohibitions? How do we know that these are also, where is the source to that from the Torah? Where is there a hint to that from the Torah? So he says, Shenemar, because it states, Ki eskoa to avos ha'el. It says in the verse, all these abominations are to you. And the word ha'el implies that these are kashos, that these are very harsh ones. Miklal, that implies, as the Gemara ikarakos, that there are less severe prohibitions. What are these? These are the rabbinic prohibitions. What are these? These are called shnios. These are second degree relatives. The Gemara says, how do we know that el is an expression of harshness? Because it states this, the mighty ones of the land he took. And that's Nebuchadnezzar when he exiled the Israelites. So the el is the mighty ones. So the Gemara says, well, maybe this argues with Rabbi Levi talk, because he saw it. Rabbi Levi said that the punishment of somebody who's dishonest with weights and measures is actually worse than the punishment of somebody who's dishonest with their sexual sins, or not dishonest, who's sinful in their sexual practice. Because, by the way, it's a very important point. We often just colloquially, we judge people harsher for their sexual mistakes than if they're like cheat a little in business. But the Talmud says that it's worse to be dishonest, as it states, because about the weights and measures it says Elah, but about the sexual sin it says El. So we see that Elah is harsher than El. The Gemara says you're right. El is kasha, El is harsh, but Elah is kasha me'el. But Elah is harder than El, more severe than El. But we still see that El is severe. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, but by sexual sins, it also says the word Elah, meaning say it's also harsh. The Gemara says, no, that's just to exclude that if you're dishonest with your weights and measures, you don't get the kares penalty. If you violate the sexual sin, for some of them you get kares, but for weights and measures, you don't get kares. So if that's the case, so what's the stringency of it? Why is it so severe? And how does it manifest itself? The Gemara says, Hani afshar b'tshuva, hani lo afshar b'tshuva. For sexual sin, you could always repent, but for being dishonest in business, how are you going to repent for that? If you steal from every customer, how are you going to track down all your customers? So everybody loves to, you could repent for one, but not for the other. That's why it's so severe. Rabbi Yehuda says the source for the secondary relatives being prohibited is from the following verse from Koheles. It says in Koheles, that Solomon was investigating and he made many parables. Before Solomon, the Torah was like a basket that had no handles. And Solomon came and made handles for it. Rabbi Shaya says from here, meaning what are those handles? Those handles are the secondary relatives that are prohibited. Rabbi Shaya says from here, Pira'eo expanded Alta Vorbo Satame Vavor. Meaning to say that you take the Torah, you're supposed to expand it. And that means to say enlarge it and find the other prohibitions. So the Gemara says now, Amarav Ashi Mashal to Rabbi Oshaya Lamad Davar Dumah. This parable with Rabbi Oshaya, what's it similar to? Meaning to say where you're supposed to expand the Torah and include other prohibitions. Adam Mishamer Pardes, that to a person who's guarding an orchard. Mishamer Bibachutz, if he guards it on the outside, Kul Mishtamer, he's really going to be able to guard the whole orchard. Mishamer Bibivnim, if he guards it on the inside, Shalafanim Mishtamer, Shalachar Mishtamer. He's only guarding what's in front of him, but not behind him. And so too with rabbinic prohibitions. If you just guard the outside, if you just guard the inside, you're not guarding the whole Torah. But if you guard the outside, you're guarding the whole Torah. The Gemara says, but actually what Rav Ashi says is Badusahi, it's wrong. Awesome, shalfan of me mishtamer. There you're at least guarding something if you're inside the orchard. Hacha ilav shnios, if you wouldn't be prohibiting these secondary relatives, paga ilav shnios paga ba'orva gufa. You'd actually be violating the erva herself. And so therefore we do the secondary degree relatives to prevent even the erva itself. Rav Kahana Amar Me'acha. I said earlier, I think that's because this is a strange parable, but what I think the Gemara here is saying is that the secondary relatives are not just to protect you from sinning against the primary relatives. There's something inherently wrong with them, even though they're not actually biblically prohibited. Something inherently wrong with that relationship. Rav Kahana Amar Me'acha. Rav Kahana says a different source for this idea. It says, "Ushmartem es mishmarti, you shall guard my commandments." That's what it states in the verse. And then we see from here, what does that mean? Asu mishmer asu mishmarti. Make a fence for my commandments. Amar Abaye or Rav Yosef, how diaraisa? Well, that's biblical law. Gemara says, no, it's not really biblical diaraisa. Pure shura rabbanon. It was in a verse in Torah, but the rabbis explained it. When Gemara says, "Kol Torah nami Pirsha Rabbanon," the rabbis explain the whole Torah. Almi the Rabbanon, it's rabbinic. The cross machta ba'alma. The verse is just to support. It doesn't. Not every time you cite a verse in the Torah doesn't mean it's a biblical law. In this case, the verse is just a support for it. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon. So now we're going to talk about these secondary relatives. A little bit confusing. We'll just do the best to follow along. A little confusing, but you have to go over it 2, 3, 4 times to finally get it, but figure out the cases. What are these secondary relatives? So the Gemara is going to cite a price where we list 8 of them. What are these? What are they? As follows: Amy Mo, your grandmother, your maternal grandmother. Aim Aviv, your paternal grandmother. Ashes Avi Aviv, the wife of your paternal grandfather. Ashes Avi Imo, the wife of your maternal grandfather. Ashes Achia Av Minaim, the wife of your father's maternal brother. The Ashes Achia Aim Minaav, wife of your mother's paternal father. Brother. The Kalas Beno, your son's daughter-in-law. The Kalas Pito, and your daughter's daughter-in-law. So those are the 8. Those are the 8 rabbinic prohibitions. Umutar Adam, and now this is going to be shocking, but these are the cases where actually you're allowed to marry. Mutar Adam, a person is going to be allowed to marry Eishes Chamav, his father-in-law's wife. Obviously, not his wife's mother, but his father-in-law's wife. If his father-in-law remarried after he remarried, Ube'eshes Chorgo, or you're allowed to marry the wife of your stepson. Ra'asar Bebas Chorgo, but you're not allowed to marry the daughter of your stepson. The Chorgo, and the stepson himself, Mutar Be'ishto, you're allowed to marry his wife, Ubito, and you're allowed to marry his wife's, and you're allowed to marry his wife's daughter, the Eshet Chargo Omerlo, and the hold on one second, and the wife of the Chargo. Hold on one second. Okay, right. And the Eshet Chargo Omerlo, and the wife of his stepson could say to him, Ani Muteris Lacha. She could say, the wife of his stepson could say to him, I'm allowed to marry you, Ubiti Asur Lacha. But my daughter is prohibited to marry you, because my daughter is actually the granddaughter of your wife, and that's not going to be allowed to you. But so I'm allowed to marry you, but my daughter is not. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Bat Chargo, the daughter of his stepson, is diraisi. That's a biblical law, because it states as bas bina, that's bas bita. You're the daughter of her son and the daughter of her daughter. They're both prohibited to you biblically. That means that you're not to be with your wife's, you're not to marry your wife's granddaughter. So the Gemara says, no, mishum the kabayla misnei seifa, because in the concluding clause we want to say Eishes Chargo Omeraslo Animu Terescha Ubiti Asuracha, because we want to say that the wife of your stepson could say to him, I'm allowed to be with you, but my daughter is prohibited to you. And even though my daughter is prohibited to you, biblically speaking, and the rabbis didn't make any decrees about me. So therefore, for this reason, Tana Reisha Nami, therefore we also say the first clause, Bat Chargo, of the daughter of his stepson. Meaning to say it was set up, it was put into set up that the case that you're allowed to marry your wife's stepson. Well, the stepson of your wife. The wife of your stepson. The Gemara says, if that's the case, Nami, the wife of your father-in-law can also say, Tema, she could say, I'm allowed to marry you. I'm allowed to marry you. Biti Asur, but my daughter can't marry you because my daughter is the sister. She's the sister of your wife. Gemara says, no, they wouldn't include that case, because when it comes to two sisters, that's actually a prohibition that will end. When your wife dies, you can marry her sister. So therefore, we didn't want to include that case because it's not forever. But the other case is forever. They can never marry your wife's granddaughter, but you are always allowed to marry your stepson's wife. Amarav Arba Nashim Yeshlan Hefsek. So Rav says about 4 women. They have a hefsek, meaning to say that the prohibition stops with them. It doesn't continue up or down in other generations. Naka Rav Biyade plus. Rav had this tradition, but Rav himself only knew about 3 of them. He only held 3 of them. What are these cases that we're referring to? That these 4 women, that there's a hefsek, and Rav only held 3 of them. We always specified about 3 of them. What are the 3? Eishes Achiaim, your Mina'av. So your uncle, how is he your uncle? He's your mother's paternal brother. Your mother's paternal brother, meaning your maternal uncle via paternal. Your mother's paternal brother. The Eishes means that there's only one aspect of a father in there. All the prohibitions of Erva biblically are from the father. Not all, but many of them are from the father. So the father is worse from the perspective of prohibitions. So in this case, it's the mother's paternal brother. So therefore, that's the prohibition. And also, Eishes Achia Av Minaim, also your father's maternal brother's wife is going to be prohibited to you. But those stop right there. Vikala so, and your daughter-in-law. We're going to see what that means. Uziiri Mosif, Ziiri also adds, Af Eishes Avimo, your maternal grandfather's wife also. So the Gemara says, Amar Amnachmar Yitzchak v'simanech the Eli derav, and the way you remember is the one above Rav. You remember what Ziri says because Rav was mentioning the uncles, and Ziri mentions the grandfather, which is one generation higher. V'Rav my time why didn't Rav count the maternal grandfather's wife? Because Rav said he says it doesn't stop because Milchofei be'eshes avi aviv, because he says you might come to confuse that with the wife of your paternal grandfather, and so therefore you might come to confuse them. And Zeiri says, no, with your father's wife, a person goes there and he knows there's a relative more than the maternal side, so he's not going to confuse them. But by the mother's side, where the prohibitions are not as intense, you wouldn't know that. So now the Gemara analyzes the statement. Kawasa, what do you mean the daughter-in-law, it stops there? It should continue on. The daughter-in-law is a biblical prohibition. You're not allowed to marry your daughter-in-law. So why do we say that the prohibition stops with your daughter-in-law? It doesn't go up and down for other generations. Where it says Ema Kalas Beno, no, when it says your daughter-in-law, it doesn't mean that it stops with your daughter-in-law. It means your son's daughter-in-law. Your son's daughter-in-law, that's the prohibition. Where it says, does the prohibition stop with your son's daughter-in-law? That your daughter-in-law is a biblical prohibition. Tawas beno, your son's daughter-in-law, shnia is a rabbinic prohibition. And all your grandsons, your great-grandsons, your great-grandsons' daughters-in-law, they're all prohibited to you, rabbinically. So, okay, what we're talking about here is your daughter's daughter-in-law is going to be prohibited to you rabbinically, and it stops there. I heard this teaching from a great man, Manu, and who is he? Rabbi Ami. And he was Rabbi Ami. And what did he say? Well, asu kawa elnei kawa. And this teaching that I heard was they prohibited a kawa only because of a kawa. I didn't know what that meant. And they said, Kaldai milafana haves. And a Kaldai said to me that you're going to be a great teacher. And I said to myself, well, what kind of teacher? I could be a professor in Volozhin, or I could be a school teacher. And even though school teacher is incredibly important, he wanted to have the distinguished idea of being like a great scholar. So he said, Iga Baraba Havina. So I said to myself, so that he had basically a mystical vision. Somebody gave him a magical reading that he's going to be a great teacher. So he said, what kind of teacher am I going to be? He says, Iga Baraba Havina. If I'm going to be a great teacher, Azra Midaiti, I'll be able to explain this on my own. Imikra Dedarliki, if I'm going to be a school teacher, then Avina. Then I'll just ask the rabbis that come to the synagogue. I'll ask them what the answer is. So what happened? Hashta. So then I thought about it on my own. What did I say? Now, what does it mean that they prohibited the daughter-in-law because of the other daughter-in-law? It means the only reason why they prohibited your daughter's daughter-in-law is because of your son's daughter-in-law, and so therefore we see that it's not as intense a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore it stops with her and doesn't go on to your daughter's daughter-in-law. It's not going to be prohibited to you. So technically speaking, you can marry your daughter's daughter-in-law according to this. He says, yeah, where do we see this situation where you could confuse your daughter's daughter-in-law with your son's daughter-in-law, like the family of the Bar Tzitai? Rav Papa said could go in Kalas to be Rav Papa Baraba, like the daughter-in-law of the house of Rav Papa. Rav Ashda could go in Kalas to be Mari Bar Yisak. These are all cases where they were at the daughter's daughter-in-law and the son's daughter-in-law at the same time, so they could confuse them. So the Gemara says, we had said that you're not allowed to marry your mother's paternal brother is wife, and your father's maternal brother's wife. But what about the case of where it is Eishes Achia Ha'em Min Ha'em? What about your mother's maternal brother's wife, which is it doesn't have any aspect of the father in there, and the father is more severe when it comes to prohibited relationships. Do we say Eishes Achia Ha'em Min Ha'am Eishes Achia Ha'em Min Ha'av? Then those cases, the Ikot Sad Av, those cases, there's at least one aspect of a paternal in there. If it's your mother's paternal brother's wife or your father's maternal brother's wife, so therefore they made the decree. The guys are rabbanim. Where there's no aspect of the father at all there, maybe they didn't make a decree. Or maybe it doesn't matter. Rav Safra says he gufa gzera. I mean, the mother's paternal brother is itself a decree. The mother's paternal brother's wife is itself a rabbinic decree. And you want us to get up and make a decree upon a decree? You want us to make a decree upon a decree? We're not going to make a decree upon a decree. It's too much. So, and how is this? So Rava says everything is a decree upon a decree. That's not a good answer. Yeah, everything, and when we come to these prohibited relationships, everything is going to be a decree upon a decree. Imo is erva. Your mother is a biblical prohibition. Aim imo, your grandmother, your mother's mother is a shnia. It's a rabbinic prohibition. The Gazru and the rabbis made a decree. I'll aim of it, mishum aim imo. And the rabbi said your paternal grandmother is going to be prohibited because of your maternal grandmother. For time of my, what's the reasoning? Because cool the beima rabbasakarle. Everybody's called your grandmother, so we say it's all prohibited. So too, Eishes Aviv, your father's wife is erva. Your father's wife is a biblical prohibition. Eishes Aviv, the wife of your grandfather, is a shnia. She's the wife of your father's father is a rabbinic prohibition. The girls are all Eishes Avimo, and they made a decree about the wife of your maternal grandfather, which is Eishes Aviv, because of the wife of your paternal grandfather. But time am I, and what's the reasoning? Cool to be Abba Rabba Karle, because everybody's called to like you're coming from your grandfather's house. So to Eishes Achia Av Min Ha'av, that the wife of your father's paternal brother is an erva, which is prohibited. Eishes Achia Av Min Ha'em, the wife of your maternal, the wife of your father's maternal brother is a shnia, is a secondary prohibition. The Gazral Eishes Achia Ha'em Min Ha'av, and they made a decree about your mother's paternal brother's wife, Mishum Eishes Achia Av Min Ha'em, because you might confuse it with your mother, with the wife of your father's maternal brother. The time of my, why? Everybody's your uncle, and so therefore they're prohibiting it. So the Gemara says, well, what's the solution here? What are we going to say? What's the answer in the end here? So the Gemara says, Tashma. He says it's following: Kol Shem in the Keva Erva. Anytime where if they would be a woman, it would be considered a biblical prohibition. Bezachar, and by a male, anytime if there's a woman, it will be considered a prohibition. Bezachar Gazra al Ishto Mishum Shneim. When it will be a male, they made the decree for a rabbinic decree, a secondary decree. Meaning to say, like in this, if this would have been a female relative, you would be prohibited. So now when it's a male, they make the secondary rabbinic prohibition against his wife. Now I'm a Rab, so therefore in this case, she's going to be prohibited rabbinically to marry to marry your mother's maternal brother's wife. Now I'm a Rava V'Kolo. Rava says, is this really a general rule? Don't we have a principle? Chamoso is erva. Your mother-in-law is prohibited, but Eishes Chamav, but the wife of your father-in-law is muteris, is going to be permitted. Bas Chamos, so the daughter of your mother-in-law is an erva. The daughter of your father-in-law's wife is prohibited to you, but Eishes Ben Chamoso, but the wife of your mother-in-law's son is permitted to you. Muteris Bas Chamav, the daughter of your father-in-law is an erva, but Eishes Ben Chamav, but the wife of your father-in-law's son is permitted. So we see that all this general principle that you just said is not true. And we said also Chorgoso is an erva, that your stepson is your stepdaughter is the daughter of your wife is prohibited, but Aisha's Hargo, but the wife of your stepson, we said on the previous page, is Muteris, it's permitted. Bas Hargo, so the daughter of your stepson, the daughter of your stepdaughter, or the daughter of your stepson is both Erva, is both going to be permitted. But Aisha's Ben Hargo, but the wife of your stepson, the wife of your stepson, is the wife of your step grandson is muteris, is permitted. V'hadar Rav Yehuda bar Shila, and this principle of Rav Yehuda bar Shila that it says kol shavan keva era b'zachar gazar al ishto. So this principle that Rav Yehuda bar Shila said, which we said is not really true, that any time where if it will be a female be prohibited, they made a decree upon the wife of the male. What's it coming to include? Isn't it coming to include the case that we're asking about? Are we coming to include then, therefore, this case of your mother's maternal brother's wife, which is the Kolshan Menakeva Erva, that if it would have been a woman, it would be prohibited. But Zachar Gazru, by a male, they made a decree. So the Gemara said, and they made a decree upon his wife, Misham Shania, because it was a rabbinic prohibition. The Gemara says, well, no, it's not true. So the Gemara says, why did Rabbi Yehuda bar Shila say in this case of the maternal, your mother's brother, maternal brother's wife, that it's prohibited, but in the other cases it's permitted? The Gemara explains that the fundamental conceptual difference is how the Chad Kedushin Mikravla. So he says, how the Chad Kedushin Mikravla. It depends how many betrothals you need to get to have a relative. If it needs to come through one marriage, then we're going to prohibit it. Like in the case of your mother's maternal brother's wife, it's just one marriage away. But in the case of two marriages, like for example, your stepson's wife, then we're going to say it takes two betrothals to get there, and so therefore we're not going to prohibit it. So the Gemara says, so you should teach us okay, I guess. So the wife of your grandfather's brother and the sister of your paternal grandfather, what's the law? Do we say midulamata erva from the fact that below, if they would go down the same number of generations would be prohibited? So also the rabbi said above it's also going to be a prohibition. Or do we say no, it's not a prohibition? So the Gemara says Tashma, ma'ain shnios. Well, we had on the previous page, what are these rabbinic prohibitions? And we listed 8. We didn't list these cases. We didn't list the case of your grandfather's brother's wife or your grandfather's sister. We didn't list them. So Gemara says that's not approved. Ton of a shear. The Brisa left some things over. When Gemara says my shear, the high shear, why did he leave these things over? What else did he leave over? Well, he left over shnios to bay Rebbe Chia. We'll see on tomorrow's daf that Rebbe Chia listed 6 other rabbinic prohibitions. So the Gemara says Ameimer elchshar be'eshes achia avi aviv. Ameimer says you're allowed to marry the wife of your father's paternal grandfather, ubachos avi aviv, and also the sister of your paternal grandfather. I saw a list of these secondary prohibitions that was found by Marbrei Ravana, and they were listed on them Shitzar Surah, 16 prohibitions. My love, how do we get to these 16? Tamni Demasnisa, aren't these the 8 of our Brisa, Veshista Bei Rebbe Chia, and then the other 6 of Rebbe Chia. And then we have these additional 2 of the grandfather's brother's wife and the grandfather's sister. So that will get to 16. The Gemara says, don't we have 17? Why? Because we also have this case of don't we have this, your mother's maternal brother, which we had said is prohibited. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a question. These 2 are similar to each other. So therefore we count them as one. We need to say your grandfather's brother's wife and your grandfather's sister, they're so similar to each other, so we count them as one. Whereas your mother's maternal brother's wife, that is counted as one. That makes Shitzisra. That makes 16. Gemara says, but I nevertheless I saw that he wrote that they are prohibited, so that these are all prohibited. So the Gemara says, well, if you found this list and it said they're permitted, would you have relied upon it? No. Why? It didn't have a signature. They found this sheet without any signature. It's not signed. We don't trust it. We're not going to prohibit it if there's no signature on it. Okay, so that will stop here. Sorry, I went a little over.